In episode 1, we looked at a semi-fictional story involving the loss of a Dutch ship that was wrecked on the west coast of Australia in 1712. The ship was the Zoutdoop, and although nothing is really known about how the actual wreck occurred and the fate of the passengers and crew, we do have some facts about the start of their journey. The ship was one of the largest in the VOC, or Dutch East India Company fleet. It was the only VOC ship that was wrecked on the WA coast that had no survivors that made it back to tell their story. She had already completed 2 successful voyages to Batavia, but on this occasion she was captained by Marinus Westfleet, who had not captained a VOC ship before. Sailing with the Zoutdoop was a smaller ship, Belvliet, captained by Dirk Blauw, who was an experienced VOC captain. Quite why Dirk was not in charge of the larger ship is not explained, but he was in overall command of the expedition. The ships became becalmed, and there was a high rate of death aboard both vessels, including the death of the skipper of the Belvliet and the chief surgeon of the Zoutdoop, and both his mates, who committed suicide. It took the 2 ships 8 months to reach Cape Town. That was double the normal journey time. The Zoutdoop resupplied and recrewed, and left in the company of another ship, the Coquin. Despite being told to stay together, the Zoutdoop quickly pulled ahead of the smaller ship, and was never seen again. This is where the historical record ends and conjecture begins. It's estimated that some 70 people survived the initial shipwreck. Certainly this is a significant number, and enough to make an impact on any of the Aboriginal tribes who inhabited the area. On a beach south of the wreck there was evidence of a fire, and on the top of the cliffs there was also evidence of campsites. Artefacts found on the cliff tops included glass, pipes, barrel rungs, coins, and there were also Zoutdoop relics found in Aboriginal wells in the region, north and inland from the wreck site. A Dutch tobacco box lid and buttons were found at Well, where a large group of Aboriginal people lived long before white settlement. So let's have a look at some of the anecdotal evidence that's come to light about the wreck and its survivors. In 1834, not long after white settlement, Aboriginal men from the Whale area told stories of white men coming from the sea who gave food in exchange for spears and shields. They also described houses, 2 large and 3 small, situated on the open coast, made of wood and canvas, and of tall white men, women and children. But the most distinctive feature of the wreck site, repeated many times by the informants, was a great deal of white money, silver coins, scattered along the shore and on the platform of rock in front of the wreck. It seems to clearly indicate the site of the Zoutdoop wreck. But although European settlers thought that this was a recent event and even sent out a rescue party, it was in fact a retelling of stories passed down through the generations. The Aborigines in the area would also have known about the 2 mutineers from the Batavia, Lewis and Pelgrim, who were marooned not far away near the mouth of the Murchison River some 80 years earlier. The reaction of these castaways to the Aboriginal tribes may have influenced the reaction of the Aborigines to any later shipwreck survivors. Early European explorers report blonde hair amongst the Aborigines, and this was assumed to be evidence of intermarriage between them and Dutch shipwreck survivors. The explorers also reported that the tribes in this area showed evidence of lighter skin and distinctly Dutch facial features. It's known that blonde hair occurs in Aboriginal groups, often in children, with the hair growing darker as they age. This is most common in coastal and island communities. Unfortunately, this does not indicate a Dutch connection, as the feature is influenced by the gene TYRP1 and is unique to Aboriginal Australians and some Pacific Islanders. It evolved tens of thousands of years before Dutch contact with the Australian coast. Reports from early European explorers and settlers sometimes described Aboriginal dwellings on the west coast as being more substantial or unusual compared to typical shelters associated with nomadic lifestyles. These observations have fueled speculation about potential influences from shipwreck survivors. Dutch explorers like Dirk Hartog and Willem de Vlaming and others who visited the west coast of Australia noted structures that seemed unusual to them. These included stone arrangements, shelters and other constructs, but descriptions were often vague and formed through European perspectives. British explorer Francis Gregory reported encountering more permanent shelters in the Gascoyne and Pilbara regions. These structures appeared to make use of natural features, like rock overhangs, supplemented with constructed elements such as stone and wood walls. George Gray's expeditions along the west coast noted the use of stone structures by Aboriginal people, particularly in the Kimberley region. He described these as rudimentary houses that could have been mistaken for European-style dwellings by other explorers. Some historians have speculated that more elaborate structures could reflect influence from Dutch shipwreck survivors, such as those from the Zoutdoop. Survivors might have shared construction techniques or contributed to local practices. However, no direct evidence supports this theory. There is anecdotal and scholarly reports suggesting that some Dutch words may have been incorporated into the languages of indigenous Australian groups, potentially as a result of interactions with survivors of Dutch shipwrecks or early exploratory contacts. Certain words in the languages of Aboriginal groups from Western Australia and from the Northern Territory have been identified as possibly having Dutch origins. Examples include words for introduced objects such as ship, iron or metal, which may have been adopted to describe items brought by Europeans. A 19th century observer noted that the Yolnu people in Arnhem Land had words for items such as nails and metal that seemed phonetically similar to Dutch terms. This could be linked to early VOC contact. In Nanda, the indigenous language spoken near the Zoutdoop cliffs, there's no conclusive borrowings that have been identified, but the possibility remains underexplored. Aboriginal languages have evolved over centuries, and identifying the origin of specific words can be difficult due to phonetic shifts and blending. Many Dutch terms may have been transmitted indirectly through Malay or Indonesian intermediaries, as these regions were under Dutch control during the VOC era. While there are tantalising hints that Dutch words might have entered indigenous Australian languages, direct evidence is scarce and often ambiguous. Other Dutch shipwrecks along the Australian coast have similar stories of survival and interaction with indigenous communities. Survivors live for months on the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands, with some venturing to the mainland and encountering local peoples on their way to Batavia. 2 of the crew were marooned at the mouth of the Murchison River with a small boat, muskets and supplies as punishment for their part in the mutiny. 73 survivors from this ship reached the mainland and may have interacted with indigenous Australians, as indicated by artefacts found inland. Only 7 men managed to return to Batavia, and the rest were never seen again. This ship was part of the rescue mission for the Vrgjoldrijk. 11 of her men were lost when they went wandering in the bush. This ship was wrecked on the Abrolhos Islands. The survivors built a second ship out of the wreckage. Over a period of about 4 months, 82 of the crew reached Batavia, and shows just how long people could have survived on the coast if they had to. It's significant that numbers of shipwreck survivors managed to survive for months on end. It seems more than likely that the large groups from the Zoutdoop and the Drake could have survived for months, if not years, after they were shipwrecked. While the likely outcomes seem to be tantalisingly realistic, there's no direct evidence to support the intermarriage of Dutch survivors and Aboriginal people. At this stage, it's all just an interesting possibility that might never be confirmed one way or the other.